All right, so welcome to week 4. We are talking this week about aging, the biological process. So today we're going to specifically cover some of the concepts that are in the book chapter on why do we age, the different theories of aging, and also focus in on this controversy that's highlighted in readings 9 and 10 of your text, which I would encourage you to go over. They're very short on the idea of should we fix it? Can we fix aging? But not only can we, should we fix aging? All right, so there's also an article reading this week on the reasons why we live longer, and I'll go over that. And at the end, I'll share the results of my longevity quiz you guys will be completing. And if you can beat me, you should definitely email me and I'll give out an extra credit point for everybody who gets over my age. And I might feel generous and give out a few extra credit points if you get close. Okay. So first of all, I want to give you a sense of a few of the things that we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about our lifespan as humans, our life expectancy. Key to issues of aging lately is compression and morbidity, which everybody seems to be talking about because this is a concept that means a better, longer life, not just a longer life, but a better, longer life. We're going to talk about a little bit about just the normal aging process. What kinds of things have we theorized that cause our bodies to age and eventually expire? And then we'll focus on the should we fix it? And then how can we promote a longer life? Alrighty. So you've seen these terms several times. I've already talked about them before in this class. But what are the terms of aging? So we have life expectancy and we have lifespan. So life expectancy is basically how long do we live? And these arrows just indicate different trajectories of people for how long do they live in life. So this one being dying the youngest, living a little bit longer, living a little bit longer. So for this, on average, our life expectancy, or how long we expect to live, is about 81 for women, about 76 for men. On the other hand, lifespan is the maximum amount of years we as a species could live. Right now, it's set at about 120. We have at least one example of someone who's just beat it, a woman in France, Jean Clement. She has lived to 120. She lived to 122. We also have heard recently that there is a gentleman in Europe who had lived longer than that, but I can't confirm that that's true because it was from a less than reputable source, let's just say. So, but there are people out there living to our life expectancy. But on average, we expect to live much less than that. So if you watched the video on blue zones already, which you should this week, they framed it in a sense like as we're leaving 12 good years on the table, right? If we think about how long we live on average to how long we could live, we're leaving about 12 good years on the table. So we'll talk a little bit later about some geographical groups who seem to have extended our life expectancy and lived a longer quality life, and what kinds of things that they do to do that. Okay, so what do we really want from life expectancy? So in the book, and also sort of a popular explanation of life expectancy, is the 1-Haas-Shea. So this is a graphical depiction of that. And this is just basically depicting compression of morbidity. So what we want is, on the bottom line here, you can see sort of your lifespan and then, eventual, and then here we can see what our performance is. Not good performance to our peak performance. So what we want from life is we want to spend most of our life along this top line at our peak performance, and then with, the very, very, very end of our life, we want that 1-Haas-Shea to break down all the way to dead or zero juice in the battery left. We don't want to spend much time declining like this green line, which is a little bit of what we do as a species, right? So we have a peak performance for not that long in our life. And then at some point, it gradually starts to decrease, and we spend a decent amount of time of our lives on average at less than peak performance, right? So close to death, if you want to say, but maybe lots of disease and disability is a good way to show it. So instead of that one Haché metaphor where the thing's working and carrying you around like a dream, like it did when you first bought it, and then boom, right before it's done, it breaks down. What most of us have is a fairly unreliable form of transportation after it's, reached its midlife. We had constantly taken it in for repairs. It has a lot of problems. It's a one Haché that we have to continually keep trying to fix, and it may not take us very far towards the end. This is the compression of morbidity, right? So what we're trying to do in life is this graph, if we're looking at it differently, this graph is what an average prototypical lingering chronically ill life would be like, right? So you might have one infectious disease earlier in life, and then around your 50s, here you start to have these chronic diseases, like you might have a heart attack, you'll have a stroke, you get lung cancer, but you spend, 30 years or so of your life with chronic disease, including something like emphysema, or could be diabetes, could be heart disease, could be a lot of things. But this is what our life looks like at this point for most people, is you spend a decent amount of time with chronic disease and disability. If we are extending the time in life where we have quality life, that's compression of morbidity. We're compressing all of those morbidities or diseases to the very end of our life, and maybe even skipping a few because we don't live long enough to see lung cancer happen, or Alzheimer's disease to actually develop in us to where it shows. But instead of starting around our mid-40s, we see disease and disability starting much, much later in life, potentially into our 70s, and then we only spend a very small amount of time. That one Haché breaks down very shortly before death, and we don't see as much disease and disability. So this bottom graph here is compression of morbidity. The other possibilities that I want to alert you to are just shifting this whole thing over and living longer. So just because we extend life, and this plays into the argument of should we fix aging, just because we extend life over time doesn't mean that we're actually fixing things better, that you have a longer quality of life. We could just shift this whole thing, 5 years down the road, but you still have all of this disease and morbidity. You still have 30 years of it. You just live longer. So you had a longer life span without disease, but you also have the full disease span because you just extended your life, but you didn't compress the time with disease at all. Okay. So that is compression of morbidity. And let me give you, there's some readings in your text about this as well. And let me give you the bottom line of if we're doing this or not. We do have some studies that show certain diseases maybe are less prevalent at younger ages. We don't have as much as we used to. But overall in the trends, when you're looking at epidemiological data across the US and really across the world, it looks like we're not quite making it. We may have less disease, less of some diseases, but we still have tons of others, particularly diabetes and heart disease, are continuing to soar. So we haven't really achieved compression of morbidity, or this bottom one. We're really just extending life, but still having that average 25 to 30 years of disease for most people. And just the types of diseases might be slightly different. One might be more prevalent than in the past, but we have not achieved it to this point. Okay. So what is normal aging? Normal aging is a universal process. The causes of it are multifaceted. It's an inevitable thing. We're all aging. It's a biological process, but and it's important to note that it's not a disease. Aging is not a disease in of itself. Diabetes is a disease. Heart disease is a disease. Cancer is a disease. Aging is normal, right? So everyone goes through it. It's a normal biological process. Usually involves some kind of functional loss, and eventually, right, we're susceptible to disease and death. Eventually, depending on how you live your life, what genetics you were passed down, what your environmental circumstances are, you could live less time with functional loss and disease, or more, depending on who you are. But everyone will get some kind of form of disease and will eventually die, right? So aging is universal, but it's also variable. So different organisms, not just us, you see in this picture here, how long different types of animals live. And, we've got the tortoise over at the very end, and, like one-celled organisms and things very much at the other end, but everybody has a different lifespan, or the longest amount they can live. When we look at the rate of living theory, so one theory of why different organisms have different lifespans, the rate of living theory would say that it's metabolism. So how fast your metabolism is, if you have more rapid metabolism, you'll have a shorter lifespan. So when you think about the tortoise and the slow-moving turtle, it has the longest lifespan. But if you're looking at things like fruit flies or hummingbirds, or things that have much higher metabolisms, they have much shorter lives. So this has promising results for it could be rate of living or metabolism that is programming our aging. But there are also examples that don't fit that. So organisms that have much higher metabolisms than another but don't live, but have just as long or longer lifespans. So it might be part of it. We're not saying metabolism isn't important to how you age, but it's just part of the picture, which you're going to hear a lot, right? You're going to hear me say that a lot in the next few slides, because everybody has a different theory on why we age, or there's several out there. And the bigger picture is usually there are a billion explanations for aging. Not a billion, but there's a lot of different reasons why we age. So why do we age? The devastating effects of long life syndrome. So this is one of the things that we have. See, we start off peak performance and we end up at our lowest performance rate. So what happens to us? And these theories are all in your book. If you want more information about them, I would direct you there. But this, the wear and tear theory basically says is that it's the cumulative damage to our cells, to our tissues, to our DNA over time that causes us to age. It's kind of a breakdown. So you can see the old rusty car here, that idea that over time, you're going to accumulate damage to your car pretty soon. If you drove it for long enough, or tried to, or left it in the yard, you'd see that it's just a junker, right, at the end. So there are use on your body, so just the normal everyday wear and tear. You have accidents, there are diseases, different environmental threats like radiation and toxins. There are a lot of different things that adversely, that cause tear or wear on your body. And eventually there's so much that it quits. That's the idea. So it can definitely explain some disease processes, especially like osteoarthritis or cataracts, which is vision loss due to degeneration. But wear and tear theory doesn't account for everything. And if you think about it, it doesn't really account for the fact that our body has natural repair mechanisms, right? So unlike a car, unlike just wear and tear over time, we also repair, and at different rates, and different people have different rates. So it doesn't quite explain it. See, there it is again. It doesn't quite explain it. Right, the autoimmune theory. So this is similar to the process that happens in an autoimmune disease, right? So in your immune system, you have these defense mechanisms against foreign or intruding disease or pathogenic cells or toxins, right? So that's your immune system in a nutshell. So what this says, which is similar to an autoimmune disease, is that over time, we are diversifying in our cells so much, or have so much cell sort of mutation and things over time, that our body's immune system can't distinguish between our own cells and bad cells over time, so it starts to attack, which is sort of like that bottom picture there. So that's what happens in an autoimmune disease, and they theorize that in aging, that might be what is happening to our cells, which again has some evidence for it, but again, limited. The aging clock theory is that our bodies are programmed to eventually expire at a certain point. So your genetics basically have programmed your body to say, all right, that's it. Kind of like, the biological clock. We're programmed to do certain things at certain times, and including death. And part of that is, like, there's a cellular variant to this, right, where every cell is programmed to have a certain amount of life and then will die at a certain time. So people have theorized it could be a gland like the hypothalamus, thymus, or the pituitary gland that is this internal clock of ours that regulates changes over time. And there is some animal study evidence for things like hormones, like DHEA supplements, supplements in lab rats. The more you have, the longer they have found to live, but it doesn't work with everything, right? So programming might exist for us hormonally in some ways, but it's not really showing in human studies per se that it's contributing to our lifespan. There is some evidence that it contributes to the disease process, but not necessarily programmed in to say you're aging at this rate, cell die. So, all right, that's the aging clock theory. There's also a cross-linkage theory, which has to do with the amount of collagen fibers that you have in your body. So as we know, and you probably, unfortunately, as women know this more so, that over time, collagen in our body breaks down in different ways and forms these sort of maladaptive links that you can see over on this side, and that allow different types of molecules to form together that shouldn't be there, and essentially hardens our tissues. So this process does happen. We can see it in wrinkles for sure. So we know that there are cross links that happen that break down things in our body. And this piling up of molecules that aren't supposed to be together, that are hardening things, they hypothesize that this is also happening in cell function, and it's causing cell death. So cross linkages, instead of looking nice like this on the other side, where our collagens are protecting different molecules from becoming cross-linked, we have these cross-links as we age, and then due to breakdown in collagen fibers or misalignment, I guess, and then we age. So there's, again, some evidence, especially in more hormonal diseases, like people with diabetes tend to have a lot of cross-linked proteins, but it hasn't really shown in lifespan or longevity. Free radicals is a really big area. So a lot of different theories have the idea of free radicals. So if you don't know about a free radical theory, definitely this is going to be a small primer. Essentially, there are free radicals were problematic substances that come and attack your cells. They're a byproduct of oxygen and your metabolism. They're highly reactive and toxic with other cells, and they make abnormal molecules in your body. So they basically damage your cells. So free radicals could be from a number of things, like your environment. You could have them genetically. Or you could have a disease that produces them genetically, but a lot of times too from environment. or lifestyle, so they will break down your cells over time. And antioxidants have been shown to help with free radicals. However, in studies where we give antioxidants, in animal studies, when we give antioxidants, they don't necessarily, antioxidant amount being high and free radical amount being lower don't necessarily show longer life, particularly in animal studies. So it's mixed. They do good things. They affect disease, certainly, but again, not quite lifespan or longevity. But they are part of the picture. Cellular theory has been very popular, particularly lately, and cellular theories of aging propose that human aging is the result of our cells aging, where you have an increasing proportion of your cells that are getting ticked off as they divide. So there is a weakening of your cell over time as it divides and divides and divides and divides, right? So cells who have, and when we see older cells, so evidence of this is when we see older cells, they have shortened telomeres, which if you're looking at these, they're sort of protective substances at the end of your cell, your telomeres. And when you look at older cells that have divided and divided and divided over time, we see shortened and shortened and shortened telomeres until we have none, and their protection of the cell is less, and the cell is susceptible to more damage. So these, the idea is that your cells are pre-programmed to have a certain number of divisions until they're going to die. So your telomeres shorten and shorten and shorten. And there's a lot of telomere shortening research out there, such as the effect of stress on your cellular telomeres and how telomeres have been looked and correlated with aging. So this definitely has a lot of promise, but again, not the full picture of aging, but part of it. And that could be related to cellular division and those loss of telomeres. Okay. Those are the major theories of why we biologically age. Of course, there is a lot of variance to them, and there's much more nuance than I can provide you here. But now let's transition into the idea of fixing aging. So in your readings, as I mentioned, we have lately had a resurgence of people looking at the idea that we can fix aging, or how do we fix aging, and not just fix disease, really. That's it's similar but a different conversation than how do we fix the processes of aging. So those things that have been identified, which there are 7 to 9, depending on what research you look at, processes identified responsible for senescence or aging. Things like genomic instability, telomere attrition, which we just talked about, different alterations at the epigenetic level, so cellular mutation, loss of proteostasis, your deregulated nutrient sensing in your body, mitochondrial dysfunctioning, stem cell exhaustion, all of those types of things that are really related at a very microscopic level to show aging. So readings 9 and 10 are talking about this controversy of fixing aging. And Aubrey de Grey has been a pretty famous name in the we can fix it, we can live for thousands of years, where if we just have to fix these 7 things, he's identified 7 in aging. And he says, why not? Why shouldn't we live forever? Why should we, it would be a crime to not let people live longer if we knew we could try to fix it. And he dismisses the argument that we would be playing God, but sees it as a purely scientific approach, right? We could fix aging, why wouldn't we? And here are the ways in which we could do it. And he has a lab dedicated to fixing aging, basically. On the other hand, you have reading number 10 from S.J. Olshansky, which talks about it's basically saying, well, hold your horses. We aren't even close to there yet. Don't put the cart before the horse, maybe in the one hoshe, but say we aren't that close to even understanding all of the processes that relate to aging and fixing it. We're even further off. And even if so, that seems like a pie in the sky sort of thing, and questions the should we do it? So should we live forever? This is a question that I'm posing to you guys to think about. What are the moral implications of this question, first of all? When we think about living longer than we do or extending our lifespan, maybe even to a couple of hundred or even 1,000 years, think about what that might mean for future generations and how generations interact. We already have a strain on resources currently in the environment, and there is a balance, right, of how many people do we have enough water for? Are we producing more environmental toxins than our environment can handle? Are we going to see a further strain on resources? Is that going to be able to sustain us all? Those are some interesting questions. We have a lack of water in a lot of places in the U.S. already. So what would it be if we all lived another 700 years or even 100 years and continue to consume environmental resources, not just monetary resources? So can our ecosystem handle this? Maybe you see this like Aubrey de Grey and you think this is purely just a scientific issue. It's just a question of having a hypothesis, addressing it, and fixing these 7 to 9 problems associated with aging. So why wouldn't we? My question there also is, are we extending quality life if we're fixing aging? So if we're fixing aging processes, we might be fixing aging, but we might not be fixing disease. So what if we live to be 200, but we're living for 130 years with disease and disability? So it's not just a question of fixing the aging processes, but fixing disease processes. So who wants to live for 150 years with a bunch of chronic diseases and frailty? That seems like a different question than just, can I live a great life forever as the one hoshe metaphor, and then at 199 years, 9 and 51 weeks, get some form of disease and die. Great, but that's not how it works, right? So we have to think about not just extending life, but extending quality life and keeping up with that. So those are some of the questions we have around extending life. As far as what can we do to extend life now, there's a couple of different things that the book outlined. One environmental approach that is gaining some traction is calorie restriction. So those of you in nutrition, kinesiology, or other medical fields, if you're pre-med, you may have heard about calorie restriction before. But the idea is that you reduce your calories by about 15 to 25%, which is a pretty significant reduction, which has been shown to be associated with gains in biological markers of aging, like lowered metabolism, reduction of free radicals, a stronger immune system. This is primarily in animal studies at this point. Not that humans aren't showing some physical gains from calorie restriction as we have it, but we haven't quite linked that to lifespan yet and life expectancy. Genetic approach also, we have some promise in gene therapies. We have results in animal models, particularly the SIR2 gene. So overexpressing the SIR2 gene results in a lifespan extension of about 30% when we're looking at some animal studies. A lot of these studies are in worms, interestingly, but also flies. And on the opposite, if we suppress SIR2 expression, you have an earlier than expected death. But there are other genes that are being targeted as well that have promise that we're showing in animal studies. But there are genetic ways or genetic therapies to extend life as well, or at least hypothesized to. But I think the more interesting question here is, what can we do as individuals to extend our life? Not necessarily maybe extend our lifespan like Aubrey de Grey is talking about, but extend our life expectancy. So how can we live longer and better? And this would be where the blue zones can come in. So if you haven't watched the blue zones video, definitely do so. It's very interesting. Blue zones, if you want a little snippet, are geographical areas that we found around the world where people tend to live longer quality lives. And they're like grouped together in these little communities that have very interesting characteristics together that have helped them have more longevity. And some of the things are lifestyle factors, right? Such as what type of diet, the activity patterns, their social interactions is also very helpful. But also, we can't deny that these people who live in these areas together share genetic markers as well. So there's biological aspects too. But watch the Blue Zones video. It's an interesting look at how we have naturally found these long-living peoples and what we can learn from them about how to extend our own lives. Other ways to support a long life, I also gave you an additional reading, and here I'm gonna have a look at that here. Let me get a new share going. Okay. So here's the article, Is It Possible to Live Forever, that I want us to look at. And this is where we can apply some of our Is This a Good Source stuff. So Eric Barker has written this article, and he talks about living longer, gives some examples, talks about people who are big in the field of people want to live longer. But what I really wanted to focus on here is what he says helps us live longer. And this is where you have to put on your critical thinking cap a little bit with Eric, because he does say some things that are important, but I think he overextends himself quite a bit in the research. So let's go through a couple of these. Relationships are the most important thing. Social interaction, for sure, has been associated with longer life in long epidemiological studies that we have. It's related, but it's not quite sure we can go so far as to say it's the absolute most important thing to living longer, but it is important. And it certainly shouldn't downplay the importance of diet as he does, or what you do to your body. Being a good person, being helpful, giving help, having those that social capital with other people, certainly been associated with longer life. Okay. Your personality. So this is a tough one because the personality is genetic, right? It's linked to genetics. It's what we're dealt. But in fact, when they do studies, they have found that certain personality traits are linked to longer life, and conscientiousness is one of them. So being conscientious is basically being very thoughtful, being aware and thoughtful of things. So yes, that makes sense, right? So conscientious people are less likely to do crazy things like jump off bridges and, with bungee cords attached to them, and drive very fastly, or, they have a much more thoughtful, thought-provoking process. They tend to be less high in risk-taking, like some other personality characteristics like extroverts are. But that helps. But I want to underscore that conscientiousness isn't the only personality trait that is useful for extending your life, but it is one of them, because they are more likely to be aware of their bodies, understand when they're having problems, go to the doctor earlier, and those things do help. But not the only personality trait. So if you aren't super high in conscientiousness, don't worry, you can still live long. Another thing that he mentions is stress, right? So he talks here about stress isn't always a bad thing. You need some stress. And that research shows that those who work the hardest live the longest. And then he goes on to say retirement will kill you. Okay, that's where I'm drawing the line. Retirement will not kill you. That is not true. It is true, when you look at the optimal functioning curve, that some stress is important to help us with a level of arousal, helps get us going, helps activate us. But too much stress, when you take it over the hump, tends to be detrimental to our health, right? So people who work the hardest I think that depends on how you define that. When I think of people who work the hardest, I think of people who work the hardest jobs, are overworked, are manual labor jobs. Those people are certainly not benefiting and living longer because they're working super hard. But people who do have a good work ethic, who do work hard, who have that sweet spot of optimal stress that motivates but doesn't limit them or doesn't cause further problems, yes, that is helpful. And retirement will not kill you. Let me just say that again. Retirement will not kill you. And retirement is not necessarily bad for you. You can still be stressed in an optimal way when you're retired. And happiness has also been related to longer life as well. And happiness is definitely sort of ambiguous things sometimes, because a lot of things can be happiness and make you happy. But in general, a lot of those things that are related to positive lifestyles, like, being active and being social and having more positive emotional experiences than negative emotional experiences, are generally helpful. Okay, let me go back to the slides to share here. Okay, so this is essentially some of the things that help us live a longer life, and including some of those things in the blue zones. So